Finding Mr. Bridges, the most fascinating man you've never heard of. Hopeless romantic, rock star preacher, leader of men, and parish priest.
Hello, my name is Phil. I'm the Vicar of St Nicholas in Willoughby. We've been following the life of Dr Nathaniel Bridges, my predecessor by 250 years. Right back in episode 1, we're on episode 4 now, but in episode 1 we learnt that in February 1793 he went to Orlingbury Hall to propose to Fanny Young. But I've not told you what she said yet, and now is the moment that we find out. She said no, and we're in a bit of a unique position here because she wrote extensively to her sister Mary about the proposal, about what she felt about it, about why she said no, and the aftermath of it. And those letters were preserved in the Northamptonshire archives. I've not seen the letter myself, but luckily a lady named Ruth Barton did a PhD entitled A Treasury of Comfort, where she looked at those letters and included them in the text of her PhD thesis. So we are able to say exactly what went on. So we know that this proposal caused a lot of friction and a lot of anguish for Fanny. She says that when she received it, it made her more wretched than you can imagine. And she was talking to her brothers and her sister about the proposal. And in the end, she summarised why she had to say no.
I know he is not respected in this neighbourhood. I know I should have the cry against me of most of my friends, and I could not give them up for Dr. Bridges.
So he's not respected by the village, and she'll be a laughing stock, and her friends will disown her if she marries him. Why isn't he respected? Well, I think it's because of his evangelicalism. If you remember, in our last episode, we saw that he rolled around on the floor and banged his head on the wooden floorboards in angst and spiritual fervour. And that wasn't how you behaved in polite Georgian society. So I think Frances is worried that if she marries Bridges, then she's going to become a social pariah. So she says no. This is going to make everything somewhat awkward in Orlingbury. I should probably explain that the setup of the village was you have the hall, which is kind of the epicenter. People, particularly the upper classes, were expected to just come and go as they pleased. The vicarage kind of backed on to the hall, so Bridges' garden backed onto hers, and it was the social expectation that he would wander through his garden into their garden, wander around the hall, be welcome, have a cup of tea, wander off back to the vicarage kind of as he pleased. So Frances was stuck in a bit of a place where in her own house she was worried that she would bump into this man whose proposal she'd just rejected at any moment. I think one of the really tragic things here is that Bridges and Frances actually have quite a lot in common. If we think back to the episode where we looked at his relationship with Samuel Parr, who was threatening him and bullying him with ruin, we see that Bridges actually got quite anxious about social interactions and anxious about having offended people. And I think we see here that Frances actually was really worried socially about what this meant. So Frances takes the view that because she'd been friendly to him, that had led him on. So the way to kind of put things right, the way to restart everything is to go cold, to not be too warm, to not be too pleasant towards Bridges, in the hope that that will stop him ever feeling led on ever again, which is absolutely awful for Bridges. He can't cope with the cold nature, so he tracks her down in the garden to have a conversation with her, and this is how she describes it in her letter to Mary.
walked in the garden, not on the terrace, for fear of seeing anyone. But my one caution availed not, for Dr. B came to the garden door and asked permission for 10 minutes' conversation. He said he had no right to say a word more, only that if I treated him with reserve or appeared to be displeased with him, it would be what he could not support, that his being at Orlingbury would depend on that. I said that I had no reason to do either from my own feelings, but I found that if my behaviour was not altered, he would take my ease in my manner for encouragement of his hopes, and that thought would give me reserve for his sake.
It's really tragic, isn't it? It sounds like they had a good friendship before he asked her to marry him. But now she thinks, well, if I carry on being friendly to him, then he's going to take that for encouragement and he'll ask me again. Whereas he's saying, actually, if you keep being cold with me, I can't stand it. I'm going to have to leave Orlingbury. And she feels completely trapped. She thinks, well, if I keep being cold and he leaves Orlingbury, I've robbed the village of its vicar. But conversely, she thinks, well, if I'm friendly with him, he's going to ask me to marry him and I'm going to be leading him on. It's really, really awkward, isn't it? And it feels like a trap. But the thing is, I think she's just overthinking it, because this proposal takes place in 1793. At this point, Frances is 33. So she spent her whole life in Orlingbury. Bridges is 43. So he's 10 years older than her, but he's been associated with Orlingbury all of his life. Yes, he's gone off to Oxford for 25 years, but he will have been back and forth in Orlingbury in that time. And this is the only time he's ever asked her to marry him. We know from his letter to Martin Roth that we saw in episode 1 that yes, he had been planning this for some time, but he was quite sanguine and quite open about the idea that she might say no. So I think she's maybe catastrophizing a little bit, and she's assuming that he's going to take any friendliness as encouragement, when actually all the evidence point to the contrary, that actually once she's said no, they can go back to being friends again. But she just can't see it because she's in this panic mode that she is just really doesn't know what to do, and she's over worried. It's really, really tragic that they seem to have this really good relationship and this really good friendship, and this one moment where he asks her to marry him just causes them both so much anxiety and so much pain. So moving on a few years, and Nathaniel Bridges has got a new curate in Orlingbury. His name is James Hayne Binmore, and he's a man that's come highly recommended by John Newton. John Newton is a very well-respected member of the evangelical movement. You may have heard of a song he wrote called Amazing Grace. Anyway, he has recommended Binmore to Bridges, having been watching him from years. In fact, Newton says he would have given Binmore a position had he had one to give him. And it gets even sadder now, because during his time in Orlingbury, Binmore's life is struck by personal heartbreak. His wife, Elizabeth, dies in the summer of 1795, and so she's buried in Orlingbury Church, leaving James alone with their young son, Joseph. Binmore did find love again. In 1796, he's engaged to Fanny Young. Their connection appeared to be a genuine, happy love match, so much so that Fanny's social circuit often teased her about the romance. And Juliana Dolben, for instance, playfully taunted Fanny about having 4 most dangerous rivals for Binmore's affection, and then she gave quite an admiring assessment of his manners, appearance, and countenance. So I wonder how Bridges felt seeing Fanny engaged to his curate 3 years after he himself asked her to marry him. You might think that he'd be hacked off, especially as Binmore is both his apprentice, so very much the person that he's meant to be training up, and his subordinates. But as well as that, he's from the same evangelical tradition that Fanny Young rejected Bridges for being part of as well. So you might think that he'd be hacked off, but it doesn't seem to be quite that simple. Between Bridges and Binmore was clearly grounded in a deep trust. This is evidenced by the fact that when James became seriously ill in August 1796, he drafted a codicil to his will that explicitly named Dr Nathaniel Bridges as one of the legal guardians for his son Joseph. Tragically, this document was not written as a mere precaution, but in the grim expectation of death. The sadness of the situation was compounded when little Joseph died of smallpox at the end of August, just days before his father. Jane Hayne Binmore died on the 2nd of September 1796, before he and Fanny could be married. It's a tragic turn of events on so many levels. You can't help but feel for those who are caught up in it. But I think in the case of Fanny Young, we do see a profound change in her in quite a short period of time, from the panic at the proposal from Nathaniel Bridges in 1793 to the person who in 1796 receives a condolences letter from Anne Bridges, who was a relative of Nathaniel's. In it, Anne suggests that had this affliction occurred before Fanny had been enabled to see the truth as it is in Jesus, her response would likely have been one of impatience and distress. Instead, the grace with which Fanny navigated the loss suggests that she'd found a new internal anchor, one that was not merely a reaction to her engagement, but a genuine embrace of the evangelical faith that had defined Binmore's own life. So Fanny has gone from being that young woman that was so worried about what her friends would think in 1793 to a woman in 1796 who has embraced an evangelical faith that is feeding her and is helping her throughout a really traumatic, painful time in her life. Fanny Young died in 1813, aged 55. She never did marry. And it's tempting to look back on her life and think of it as a life of tragedy, losing the man that she loved, losing that kind of family that was ready and waiting for her, never following through on those romantic hopes and dreams that she wrote about in those letters to her sister Mary. But maybe in amongst the tragedy, there is a message of hope. Because I think what we see in Fanny Young is that through her interactions with Binmore, but actually probably Bridges as well, she encountered a God who was there for her when things were rough, where things were hard, and a God that it was okay to be honest with, and a God who could cope with passion and fear and anguish and all of the things that she must have gone through. So maybe in amongst the tragedy is the hope that actually God can be with us and can steer us through the hardest times. Maybe that's the message of Fanny Young's life. Well, what of Nathaniel Bridges? What happened to him after that 1793 proposal? Well, I didn't want to end this episode on all the tragedy and all the darkness and all the horrible stuff that happened. So I will tell you now that he did marry, and it was a happy marriage to a lady named Catherine. But we'll find out more about the second half of his life and the things that they achieved together in our next episode, which I'm going to call At Home with the Bridges. See you then.